Chicago, with its history of tension between law enforcement and certain neighborhoods, became ground zero. But here's what you need to understand. This incident didn't happen in isolation. For days leading up to that morning, anti-ICE crowds had been gathering near that same facility. Protesters were deliberately blocking federal vehicles, slamming on brakes in front of ICE cars, motorcycles weaving through traffic to obstruct their movement. You could see it on video, people screaming profanities, their faces twisted with rage, pounding on vehicles while federal officers sat inside, trained to stay calm but clearly under siege. Why was this happening? Because just the night before, ICE had conducted a major raid on an apartment complex in Chicago. They were targeting members of a violent gang, Tren de Aragua, a transnational criminal organization that's been terrorizing communities across South America and now, increasingly, in American cities. These aren't petty thieves. We're talking about organized criminals involved in everything from human trafficking to armed violence. So ICE moved in, middle of the night, tactical operation, the kind you'd see Navy SEALs or SWAT teams execute. They wanted the element of surprise because when you're dealing with dangerous gang members, surprise can be the difference between arrests and bloodshed. They swept through that building, pulled people out, and yes, some American citizens, including children, were temporarily detained, hands zip-tied, while agents sorted out who was who. Now, if you're sitting at home watching this on the news, you see children with their hands bound, you see families crying, you see people being marched out in the dark, and your first instinct is probably, this looks wrong, this looks like tyranny. And I get that. Nobody wants to see kids treated that way. It's disturbing, it should be. But here's the part that gets left out of most news coverage. When law enforcement executes a raid like this, especially in a building where dangerous criminals are hiding, they have to secure everyone first. They can't just walk in, politely ask who's a gang member, and expect honest answers. The protocols exist for officer safety and for the safety of everyone in that building. You detain, you identify, you release the innocent, you arrest the criminals. It's not pretty, but it's procedure. And by the end of that operation, multiple suspected gang members were arrested. The innocent people, including those children, were released within hours. But the images, those images of kids with zip ties, those went viral immediately. The damage was done. Chicago's mayor came out swinging. He called the operation dangerous, unconstitutional, and attack on poor and working people. He stood in front of cameras, voice shaking with emotion, and painted a picture of federal agents storming into black and brown neighborhoods, treating American citizens like enemy combatants. He said Trump and his administration had declared war not on criminals, but on the vulnerable. The governor of Illinois joined in, revealing that the Trump administration had given him an ultimatum: call up your National Guard troops to protect federal facilities, or we'll federalize them and do it ourselves. The governor called it outrageous, un-American, a president demanding a state send its own military against its own people. And just like that, the narrative was set. To one side of America, this was federal overreach, authoritarianism, Trump using ICE and the National Guard as his personal enforcers. To the other side, this was a president finally standing up to cities that had become sanctuaries for criminals, cities where local leaders tied the hands of federal law enforcement and let chaos reign. But here's the question nobody was asking. What was Trump's response really about? When he issued that short statement, "Stand with ICE as they continue to protect and defend our homeland. President Trump and I have your back." What did he actually mean? Most people heard political posturing, campaign rhetoric, red meat for his base. But if you listen more carefully, if you think about who that message was really for, you start to see something deeper. Trump wasn't talking to Chicago's mayor. He wasn't even really talking to the protesters or the media. He was talking to every ICE officer, every Border Patrol agent, every sheriff and National Guard member who's felt abandoned, who's watched their colleagues get attacked, threatened, doxxed online, who've seen their families harassed because of the uniform they wear. He was telling them, I see you, I know you're under siege, and I will not leave you out there alone. That's a powerful message, not because it's policy, it's not a 5-point plan, but because it's emotional, it's tribal. It tells a specific group of people that they have a leader who won't back down when the mob comes for them. And here's the thing about that kind of message. It doesn't matter if half the country hates it. It only matters that the people it's aimed at feel it. Because those are the people who will show up when you need them, who will enforce federal law even when city governments try to stop them, who will walk into dangerous situations because they believe someone has their back. Think about it this way. You're a father, maybe a grandfather. You've taught your kids, your grandkids, about right and wrong, about standing up for what you believe in, even when it's hard. Now imagine one of them grows up and becomes a police officer or joins the military. And imagine they come home one day and tell you that crowds are threatening them, that their bosses won't support them, that they feel like the whole country sees them as the villain just for doing their job. What would you tell them? You'd probably tell them to stay strong, to remember why they took that oath, to know that even if the loudest voices are against them, there are millions of people who respect what they do. You'd tell them they're not alone. That's what Trump was doing. He was being that voice. And whether you agree with his policies or not, that message resonated with a lot of people who feel like law and order has been abandoned in favor of political correctness. But there's another layer here, one that's even more important politically. When Trump said, "We have your back" to law enforcement, he was also sending a message to every mayor and governor who thinks they can ignore federal authority. He was saying, if you won't protect federal officers and federal facilities, I will, and I have the power to do it. That threat to federalize the Illinois National Guard, that wasn't an empty bluff. The federal government has full constitutional authority to protect its personnel and property. If a city or state refuses to provide that protection, or worse, if local leaders actively encourage resistance to federal law, the president can step in. And Trump was making it clear he would. Now, Chicago's leaders portrayed this as tyranny, as a president trampling on states' rights. But here's the irony. For decades, progressives have argued for a strong federal government, for Washington to override states on everything from civil rights to environmental policy to health care. They've cheered when federal judges strike down state laws they don't like. They've celebrated federal agencies imposing regulations on states that resist. But the moment a Republican president uses federal power to enforce immigration law, suddenly it's authoritarianism. You see the double standard, right? It's not really about federal power or states' rights. It's about whose team is in charge. And Trump understood this perfectly. By forcing this confrontation, by making Democratic mayors and governors defend protesters who were literally attacking federal officers, he was putting them in an impossible position. Because here's what the polls were starting to show. While the media ran endless stories about traumatized families and heavy-handed raids, while activists organized protests and politicians gave impassioned speeches, a significant portion of the American public was watching those videos of people ramming cars into ICE vehicles and thinking, yeah, maybe we do need the National Guard there. CNN, of all networks, even had one of their hosts break ranks and say out loud what a lot of people were thinking. The Democrats are making a mistake. They're fighting the wrong battle at the wrong time. See, there was this whole other crisis happening at the exact same time. The federal government was heading toward a shutdown. Congress couldn't agree on a funding bill. And the sticking point? Democrats were demanding that any short-term funding measure include extensions for certain healthcare subsidies under the Affordable Care Act. Now, those subsidies, they weren't set to expire for another month or so. There was time to negotiate, time to work out a compromise. But Democrats were drawing a line in the sand right then, threatening to shut down the entire government if they didn't get their way immediately. Republicans, meanwhile, had passed what they called a clean, continuing resolution, basically a straightforward bill that said, let's keep everything funded at current levels for a few more weeks while we work out the details. And suddenly, this CNN host, Michael Smerconish, not exactly a Trump cheerleader, goes on air and says, I'm sorry, but I don't understand why Democrats are shutting down the government over this. The Republicans aren't holding anything hostage. They're offering to maintain the status quo. If Democrats want to fight about healthcare subsidies, fine, but don't do it by making 700,000 federal workers go without paychecks. His point was simple. This is not the time and place for that fight. And a lot of Americans agreed with him, even people who supported those healthcare subsidies. Because when you're a federal employee worried about your mortgage payment, or you're waiting for your tax refund, or you need a government service, you don't care about political theater. You just want the government to function. But Democratic leadership, they saw an opportunity. They thought if they could make this about Trump and Republicans trying to gut healthcare, they could win the public relations battle and maybe even set themselves up for the midterm elections. Except it wasn't working. Because at the same time they were trying to make Trump look like the villain on healthcare, videos were circulating of protesters in Chicago trying to run over federal officers. And voters were connecting the dots. Democratic cities are in chaos. Democratic leaders are defending people who attack law enforcement, and now Democrats are shutting down the government. The narrative was getting away from them, and that's when Trump made his next move. When Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker went public with that ultimatum, when he posted on social media that Trump's Department of War had demanded he mobilize state troops or face federal intervention, he thought he was exposing authoritarian overreach. He thought the American people would be horrified that a president would threaten to take control of a state's National Guard. But think about what had just happened in the days leading up to that moment. Federal officers ambushed, a woman with a weapon trying to ram their vehicle, crowds blocking roads, screaming threats, creating chaos around a federal facility, and local law enforcement, stretched thin, unable or unwilling to fully control the situation. From Trump's perspective, and from the perspective of millions of Americans watching this unfold, the question wasn't, how dare the president threaten federal intervention? The question was, what took him so long? You see, there's a principle in leadership, and it applies whether you're running a company, a family, or a country. When you're responsible for people's safety, when you've promised to protect them, you can't just hope things get better. You can't wait for local authorities to maybe eventually get the situation under control. You have to act decisively, even if it makes you look like the bad guy. And Trump's whole political brand has always been about decisive action. Love him or hate him, nobody has ever accused him of being timid. So when he told Illinois, call up your troops, or I will, he wasn't making an idle threat. He was following through on the promise he'd made to ICE officers. We have your back. But here's where it gets really interesting politically, because the media immediately framed this as Trump sending troops into American cities, echoes of martial law, images of soldiers on street corners. That's the picture they wanted to paint. Except that's not what was happening. The National Guard troops weren't being deployed to patrol neighborhoods. They weren't going door to door. They were being stationed at federal facilities, the ICE detention center, to provide security and create a buffer between protesters and federal officers. Think of it like this. Imagine you own a small business, and every day, angry crowds gather outside, blocking your customers, threatening your employees. You call the local police, but they're overwhelmed, or maybe the mayor has told them to go easy on protesters. What do? You hire private security. You protect your people and your property because nobody else will. That's essentially what Trump was doing, except instead of hiring private security, he was using the constitutional authority of the federal government to protect federal personnel and facilities. And legally, he was on solid ground. Courts have consistently upheld the president's authority to protect federal interests, even over state objections. But the optics were terrible for him, or at least that's what the media thought. Every cable news network ran footage of the apartment raid, children with zip ties, families separated in the middle of the night. Reporters interviewed sobbing mothers who said they were American citizens, that their kids were traumatized, that they'd done nothing wrong. And those images are powerful. They should be. Nobody wants to see kids treated that way, and nobody should be comfortable with it, even if there's a legitimate law enforcement reason behind it. But here's what the media left out, and this is crucial. They left out the why. They left out the fact that this apartment building had become a known haven for gang members, that residents of that very community had been complaining about violence and drug activity, that the raid was targeting specific individuals with serious criminal records. Instead, the story became Trump's America, where children are ripped from their parents' arms in the dead of night. The governor used that exact framing. He said, Trump and his kind were declaring war on poor people, on working families, on black and brown communities. He called it a campaign of fear and chaos designed to terrorize cities into submission. And emotionally, that message works. If all you see are those images, if all you hear is that framing, of course you're going to be outraged. Of course you're going to think Trump has gone too far. But then something unexpected happened. A poll came out, the New York Times and Siena College, pretty reputable, and they asked Americans a direct question. Do you think President Trump's actions, sending National Guard troops into big cities, have gone too far? And just over half, somewhere in the low to mid-50s percentage-wise, said yes. The headline was immediate. Majority of Americans say Trump overreached. Democrats celebrated. Activists pointed to it as proof that the country was turning against Trump's immigration crackdown. It looked like a political win. Except Trump's advisors weren't worried. In fact, some reports suggested they were quietly pleased. And that might seem strange, until you understand how political messaging really works. See, that poll wasn't asking people if they approved of Trump. It was asking if they thought he'd gone too far. And too far is actually a fascinating response because it implies action. It implies strength. It implies someone who does things, even controversial things, rather than someone who sits back and watches. Now, if you're someone who already opposed Trump, of course you think he's gone too far. You thought he went too far the day he was elected. That number doesn't tell us anything new about you. But if you're someone who's been frustrated with crime, with disorder, with the sense that cities are out of control and nobody's doing anything about it, what you hear in that poll is Trump is actually doing something. Maybe it's aggressive, maybe it's controversial, but at least he's acting. And in American politics, especially among certain voter groups, the perception of strength often matters more than the perception of likability. There's a deeper psychological principle at work here. When people feel unsafe, when they feel like the world is chaotic and unpredictable, they gravitate toward leaders who project certainty and power. It doesn't matter if those leaders are always right. It doesn't even matter if people personally like them. What matters is the feeling that someone is in control. Trump understood this instinctively. He's always understood it. That's why his response to Chicago wasn't conciliatory, wasn't nuanced, wasn't an attempt to see both sides. It was bold, unequivocal, and unapologetic, because his message wasn't trying to win over people who were already against him. It was reinforcing support among people who wanted exactly that kind of leadership, and it was sending a signal to other mayors, other governors. If you create conditions where federal offices are attacked, if you refuse to cooperate with ICE, if you position your city as a sanctuary in defiance of federal law, I will come in over you. That's not a threat that wins you positive media coverage, but it's a threat that changes behavior. And over the next few weeks, you started seeing subtle shifts. A few Democratic governors quietly increased security around federal facilities. A few mayors stopped giving inflammatory press conferences about ICE raids, not because they suddenly agreed with Trump, but because they realized he was willing to follow through. Now, let's talk about what else was happening behind the scenes, because this is where the story gets really layered. While all this drama was playing out in Chicago, while the media was focused on raids and protests and confrontation, the government shutdown was dragging on. Federal employees were starting to miss paychecks. National parks were closing. Airport security lines were getting longer because TSA agents were calling in sick. And Democrats were still holding the line, insisting that any funding bill had to include those healthcare subsidies. But CNN, remember, already had one of their own hosts breaking ranks, and he kept pushing. He went on air again and said, look, Republicans have offered a clean resolution, a short-term funding bill that keeps everything running while negotiations continue. Democrats are the ones saying no. Democrats are the ones keeping the government shut down. And for what? For subsidies that don't even expire for several more weeks? His argument was simple. There's a time and place for every fight. This isn't it. And more Democrats started to quietly agree because they were looking at the same political landscape Trump's team was looking at. They were seeing protests turn violent. They were seeing their own mayors look weak or extreme. They were seeing polls that showed most Americans just wanted the government funded and functional. So, within a few days, a handful of Senate Democrats broke ranks. Not a lot, just enough. They voted with Republicans to pass that short-term funding bill. The government reopened. The healthcare subsidy fight got pushed down the road. And politically, it looked like Democrats had blinked first. But here's the thing, and this is what almost nobody in the media connected. The government shutdown and the Chicago confrontation weren't separate stories. They were the same story. They were both about federal power, about what happens when local and state governments resist or refuse to cooperate with Washington, about what happens when a president decides he's willing to force the issue. Trump's response to Chicago wasn't just about ICE or immigration. It was a demonstration. It was him showing the country and showing Democratic leaders that he was willing to use every tool at his disposal: legal authority, federal troops, public messaging, to impose order as he saw it. And the shutdown fight was Democrats testing whether they could use their leverage in Congress to force him to compromise. When that didn't work, when public opinion started turning against them, when even some of their own media allies started questioning the strategy, they backed down. So, what does all of this really mean? What's the deeper signal that most people missed? It means we're watching a fundamental shift in how federal power is being used. For the last couple of decades, presidents from both parties mostly tried to avoid direct confrontations with states and cities. They'd negotiate, they'd offer incentives, they'd work through the courts. It was all very procedural, very slow, very bureaucratic. Trump's approach is different. It's confrontational. It's public. It's designed to create pressure and force decisions quickly. And love it or hate it, it's effective in certain ways. When he told ICE officers, "We have your back," he wasn't just offering moral support. He was announcing a policy: federal law will be enforced even if city governments object, even if there are protests, even if it looks bad on the evening news. When he threatened to federalize the National Guard, he wasn't just talking tough. He was establishing a precedent: if you won't protect federal officers, I will, and I don't need your permission. And that precedent matters, because every future president will now know that option exists. Every governor and mayor will now know that defying Washington comes with risks. The balance of power between federal and local government has shifted, maybe just a little, maybe temporarily, but it's shifted. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? That depends entirely on your perspective. If you believe in strong federal enforcement of immigration law, if you think cities have become too lawless and need federal intervention, then this is a long overdue correction. It's a president finally willing to stand up to so-called sanctuary cities and enforce the law equally everywhere. If you believe in local autonomy, if you think immigration enforcement has become too aggressive and cruel, if you worry about federal overreach and the erosion of civil liberties, then this is deeply troubling. It's a step toward authoritarianism, toward a government that prioritizes order over rights. And here's the honest truth: both of those perspectives have merit. This isn't a simple good versus evil story. It's a story about competing values, about how we balance security and freedom, about who gets to decide what the law means and how it's enforced. But here's what I want you to take away from all of this, and this is really important, especially for those of us who've lived long enough to see political cycles come and go. Every time a president expands federal power, whether it's Lincoln suspending habeas corpus during the Civil War, or FDR interning Japanese Americans during World War II, or Bush creating the Department of Homeland Security after 9/11, or Obama using executive orders to protect dreamers, every single time there are people who cheer and people who protest. And the people who cheer always assume that power will only be used for good, for the things they believe in. They never imagine it being turned against them. But power doesn't care about intentions. Power is a tool. And once you create a tool, once you establish a precedent, anyone who comes after you can pick it up and use it. So when Trump used federal authority to override Chicago's mayor, when he threatened to federalize state troops, he wasn't just making a decision about immigration policy. He was expanding the toolkit of presidential power. And someday, maybe soon, a president you disagree with will have that same toolkit. That's the hidden meaning behind his response. That's what almost nobody talked about in all the shouting and protests and cable news debates. This wasn't just about Chicago. It wasn't just about ICE. It was about redefining the relationship between federal power and local resistance. And regardless of how you feel about Trump, regardless of whether you think ICE officers were heroes or villains in this story, that redefinition is going to shape American politics for years to come. Because the next time there's a protest, the next time local and federal authorities clash, both sides will remember what happened in Chicago. They'll remember that a president was willing to send troops. They'll remember that crowds attacked federal officers. They'll remember that the media took sides. They'll remember how it all played out. And they'll adjust their strategies accordingly. So the next time you hear a president respond to a city leader, don't just listen to the words. Listen to the timing. Listen to who the message is really for. Listen to what's being signaled between the lines. Because behind every statement, there's a strategy. Behind every confrontation, there's a test of power. And behind every headline, there's a deeper story about how our country is changing, who has authority, and what we're willing to accept in the name of order or justice or security. Now that you've seen what Trump's response to Chicago's mayor really meant, I want to hear from you. Was it a defense of law and order, a president standing up for officers under attack and enforcing federal law the way it's supposed to be enforced? Or was it a power move gone too far, a dangerous precedent that trades civil liberties for the appearance of control? There's no easy answer, and reasonable people can disagree, but the conversation matters. Your perspective matters.